Right, so good morning again. Uh, we only have a few studies, I guess, together. It's the last week of this school. And I've been debating what we can cover that would be beneficial, that would be helpful to us. Um, and I think we're going to play it by ear from day to day regarding the topics that we do cover. But today, I'd like us to start by considering the fulfillment of prophecy in 2019. The fulfillment of prophecy in 2019. Of course, we know that under the midnight cry, a number of predictions were made about what was going to take place in 2019, right? Of course, there's the I guess the various lines of truth that have been opened up through the midnight cry. So 2019 has come and gone. And something that we need to be able to begin to consider, to begin to think about is, can we identify the fulfillment of the things that we predicted in connection with the midnight cry message? This is important. It's important primarily for our own selves because our message is based on Bible prophecy, and a hallmark of the truthfulness of the message that we bear is that the things that are opened up through it, the things that are opened up as coming to pass, they're actually fulfilled. So it's important that if we're making predictions about things that are going to take place, and those predictions are time bound, right? They're attached to a definite span of time. It becomes crucial that we're able to identify the fulfillment. It's especially important now because, of course, we know that there's been a split in the movement. And when you look at Future for America, what is their charge against us at present? It's that we had all these predictions about things that were going to take place in 2019, but, according to them, none of them were fulfilled. So the question is, do we believe that? Do we believe that none of the things that we predicted were fulfilled? I'd like to think that if we really believe that, none of us would be here, right? But there's a difference. Why is it that while having heard the same messages, having heard the same predictions, some can look and say, look, we didn't see anything. While others, as we'll be able to see, can say, but we do see fulfillments of the things that we're identifying, right? I think the key point there is, understanding what a fulfillment looks like, right? And that's another important thing I think will be clarified through the course of this study that we're doing is we'll begin to get an understanding of what prophetic fulfillments look like. Because as Adventists, right, you tend to expect that the fulfillment of a prophecy is something grand, is something spectacular, right? But what we are seeing increasingly, what we should already understand, but what we will see as we go forward is that if you're not watching, and if you don't have an idea of what you're looking for, you can miss it. You can miss the fulfillment of prophecy and events that are the fulfillment of the very predictions that we've put on the record. They'll pass by you as just another day in the news cycle. So this study involves review. We're going to go back over the prophetic spans. Do you remember that study, prophetic spans, where Sister Tess, Elder Tess begins with 490, taking you to 2019. 220, taking 2019, 151, 126, and so on. And through that study, she was making predictions about using an end from the beginning logic, right? She was making predictions about the things that we see at the beginning of each of those prophetic spans, we're going to see at the end, right? So we're going to recap, I guess, portions of that study, and also begin to discuss, what we can see by way of fulfillment. I know that the fulfillment of Raphia was also covered. Whether it was here or in Kenya, I'm not sure. But she has begun to sort of put on the record, identifying how Raphia was fulfilled, right? And moving forward from this study, we may go to review or redo or revise that which you put on the record, right? So my hope is that, as we do the study, we're identifying the fulfillment of prophecy, and whether we can see prophetic fulfillments, where we can see prophetic fulfillments. And the idea is not only to answer the question in our own mind, not only to make it clear in our own minds that the predictions we're making are correct, but also to, I guess, to be able to answer the objections that are now out there in the public record about the truthfulness of the message that we bear, right? I think a useful starting point is to consider our prophetic pattern. We'll begin by considering our prophetic pattern. What do we see in the history of the priests? We begin in 1989. The 5 primary waymarks, 1989, 9/11, 2014, and 2019. And of course, we've spoken at length about the pattern that we see being repeated in each of these periods of time. Where we see a message unsealed, yes, an increase of knowledge, a formalization. There's a test on the formalized message, which leads to a shut door. Right, so this is the prophetic pattern. I'll just do this. So I'm just working with the assumption that, I guess we've all seen this before. I think it's been laid out in this school. We see this pattern repeating in each of the dispensations, in our history, and this is the priests. Right? Now, when we look at these waymarks, 9/11, 2014, 2019, we see with 9/11 in particular, was it understood beforehand? Did you understand 9/11 beforehand? Most of us were not here then, but of what you know, was 9/11 understood beforehand? My brother says no. Mm-hmm. We did not understand it beforehand. When was it understood? It was understood in hindsight, right? It was understood in hindsight. With 2014, what do we see? Was it understood beforehand? Yes, it was. So there's just an eye pointing to 2014. Of course, 2014 was understood when in 2012, right? So 2012, the prediction is made about 2014 being the Sunday law. So 2014 was understood before we actually got to that waymark. But what do we see after 2014? Did we have a full understanding of the waymark of 2014 before then? No, we didn't. We see that light on the waymark continue to open up after the fact, right? So after 2014, looking back in the years afterwards, we began to understand more of the significance of this waymark that had come to pass. 2019, was it understood beforehand? Yes, the midnight cry opens up. 2018. And we received light on this approaching waymark. We understood much about it beforehand. But as we see the pattern, what can we expect going forward? What can we expect going forward? So I'm going to pick on people, right? It's a class. Let's engage. We're all here to learn. I'm hoping after 3 weeks, maybe you've overcome that fear of questions, participating, I hope so. Yeah, so let's engage. Let's share your thoughts. We're all here to learn, right? We're all here to learn as best as we can. I'm here to learn as well. But I'm making the basic point that we see with these waymarks, particularly 2014 and 2019, that they are understood beforehand. But what can we understand subsequent? Well, we see with 9/11, after the fact, we received light on it. We understood with greater clarity the history that we had passed through. Right? Now 2014, 2012 are now making forward predictions about waymarks to come. But even subsequent to the fulfillment of those waymarks, we're still receiving greater clarity on their significance and what they mean. So what should we expect to see in relation to 2019? The midnight cry opened it up to us beforehand, right? And now 2019 has come and gone. Do we understand everything about 2019? Right? I think obviously we'd have to say no, because we're at the end of January. On November 9 or after November 9, if someone asked you, identify the fulfillment of Raphia, right? Identify the fulfillment of all those predictions in the prophetic spans, would you have been able to do it? No, we would not, right? But we're seeing now that this light is starting to be opened up as it was presented here, right? So I'll let you off the hook. So it's now going forward in this current dispensation. We're looking forward, but as we look back, we can expect further clarification of the history that we've passed through to be brought to bear, right? So this basic logic, in my mind, is the justification for doing the exercise that we're doing today. Okay, so The prophetic spans. I'm trying to think of the best way to lay this out. I'll do it this way. Right, so you have 2019. What was the logic behind this study? Rather than me just lay it out, because it was presented, it was one of the initial studies Elder Tess presented in October 2018 when the Midnight Cry was opening up. So my hope is that for most, if not all of us, it's revision and we've all seen it. But maybe some have not. I don't know. But does someone want to venture to explain the basic logic behind the study? I've already done some of it, right? But I'd like to ask someone to do that for us. When she laid out the prophetic spans as a study of 2019, what was the logic? What was the concept that she was presenting? Because this should be revision, right? It's not anything, it's no trick questions, right? No, just what do you remember? How would you explain it in your own words? Mugisha.
What I would say, maybe she wanted to know what is going to take place in 2019. Because she identified it to be last year. So she wanted maybe more clarity what will happen in 2019 at last year. So she wanted to bring all these prophetic signs. All of it in 2019. We are giving her how 2019 will look like. Such that when we are looking for what to take place in 2019, we have something we are looking at, not just random.
Okay. So you're saying she was taking these numbers. What numbers and why? What was the justification for taking those numbers?
I think because that those numbers are already prophetic numbers.
Okay.
So they have a prophetic significance. That's why she was using them to point 2019.
Okay. Yes.
Yeah, before 2018, we are not taken time setting seriously. It was like we are not too as to the validity of time setting, and that's why 2014 was rejected. So as we entered into 2018, we began to be confident of the validity of time setting. So anyone was now free to predict events, things like that.
Okay, so you're pointing out that, before 2019, it was at that camp in Italy. It wasn't 2019. No, it was in 2018, right? 2018, the camp in Italy, when time was opened up. You're saying before then, the issue of time setting wasn't taken seriously. So it's opened up in 2018. People start considering time, right? And then that paves the way for tests to start. That lays the foundation for this study on time spans to be considered. Okay. So you're identifying what laid the foundation for that. Then Mugisha is saying that he's laying out the concept of the study. That basically she took various prophetic numbers that we should all recognize, right? Numbers like 490. We have a 490-year prophecy. What's half of 490? 245. Right, which is half of 490. 220, which is another prophetic number that we should recognize. 151 and 126, numbers associated with the 2520. Right? Also numbers that we should recognize. 81, 30, and I think there's some others. But the concept behind the study was she was taking these prophetic numbers and connecting them to 2019 in what way? What principle was she combining with these numbers to allow them to speak to what was taking place in 2019? So she took these prophetic numbers and she brought a principle to bear that we also should recognize, that we also all recognize actually, right? And connecting these numbers to 2019 opened up light. Does someone want to elaborate? What's the principle? Yes? End from the beginning, right? So she, with these numbers, say we have 490. We have 490 years. Counting back from 2019, where does that take you? It takes you to 1529. So 490 years before 2019 takes you to 1529. And if you apply this principle that God declares the end from the beginning, what we see in 1529 is typifying what we will see in 2019. Right? That was the concept. Right? So with all these numbers, she identified events that took place at the commencement of each of these prophetic spans. And these events are typifying things that she says were going to be fulfilled in 2019. So again, can we look back now that 2019 is in the rear view mirror? And can we begin to see any fulfillments? Right? Now, this study is under development. Some of these concepts I'm still discussing with her actually, right? Some of them are clear, as we will see. Some of them are still under development. But I think it's still worth sharing, with the hope that within the context of a group study, we may be able to clarify some of these things that we haven't been able to up to this point. But I'll share the ones that I think should be the clearest to us. Right, so we can count back 490. I'll just lay out all the other ones. 245. 220. 151. 126. 'So we're not going to do them in order. We'll just do them, I think, from the easiest, from the clearest to the ones that need work. Okay. So of each of these prophetic spans, maybe I should ask, can you, yeah, maybe it's a good question to ask, because the idea is that this study is revision, right? It should be, and from the sound of it, it is for a lot of us. Can you identify any one of these that has met its fulfillment? Or that is under fulfillment before I take the step to begin to identify it? Have we thought about this? Have we given any thought that, this study laid out all these points? Can we look back and see if they've been fulfilled? And if you have, can you identify any that you can see? "151 years from 2019 takes you to what year? 1868, right? 1868. What happened in 1868? Andrew Johnson impeached. So if we're declaring the end from the beginning, applying this principle, there's an impeachment of a president of the United States, right? 151 years later, we should see a similar development. I'll just read an entry from Wikipedia by way of recap. This is Wikipedia on the impeachment of Andrew Johnson. I'll just read a few lines. It says, "The impeachment of Andrew Johnson was initiated on February 24th, 1868, when the United States House of Representatives resolved to impeach Andrew Johnson, 17th President of the United States, for high crimes and misdemeanors, which were detailed in 11 articles of impeachment. The primary charge against Johnson was violation of the Tenure of Office Act, passed by Congress in March 1867 over his veto. Specifically, he had removed from office Edwin M. Stanton, the Secretary of War, whom the act was largely designed to protect, and attempted to replace him with Brevet Major General Lorenzo Thomas. Earlier, while the Congress was not in session, Johnson had suspended Stanton and appointed General Ulysses S. Grant the Secretary of War. Johnson became the first American president to be impeached on March 2nd to 3rd, 1868, when the House formally adopted the Articles of Impeachment and forwarded them to the United States Senate for adjudication. The trial in the Senate began 3 days later, with Chief Justice Salmon P. Chase presiding. On May 16, the Senate failed to convict Johnson on one of the articles, with the 13 to 19 vote in favor of conviction falling short of the necessary 2/3 majority by a single vote. And it goes on. So Andrew Johnson fired his Secretary of War, but he did so illegally, right, against duly enacted legislation. He acted contrary to duly enacted legislation by removing a certain individual from his office as Secretary of War. And for this, impeachment proceedings were brought against him. He was eventually impeached, but what did we read? The process failed in the Senate. He was acquitted in the Senate, right? So now we come down to 2019. And the question is, what do we see? Do we see a US president being impeached? Yes, we do, right? I think it's useful just to break down briefly the process of impeachment and then identify, because it's currently underway, right? Right now, Trump has been impeached. I think we all know that. His trial in the Senate is currently underway, right? It's taking place right now as we speak. Right? So impeachment is the process by which a president, right, or someone in high office, but in this context we're dealing with the president, how the president can be removed from office for unlawful acts, high crimes and misdemeanors, as Andrew Johnson was impeached for here. So when we look at impeachment, and I want to say this within the context of some of the accusations or charges that have been brought against us. Because when November 9 passed, what was the statement now being put out by those who've departed from us? They said Trump was not impeached on November 9, so our prophecy failed. Right? Trump was not impeached on November 9, so our prediction failed. Well, the first question is, when we're identifying the impeachment of Trump, was that ever attached to the date November 9? No, it was not. Right? Andrew Johnson was not impeached on November 9, and we made no statements attaching the fulfillment of this prediction to the date November 9. In fact, when you look at all these prophetic spans, how many of them are attached to that date November 9? 3. Yes? Only 3. Most are not. Most are just placed within the year 2019. Right? But the issue is being reframed as we made all these predictions about this date in particular, and that's not what has taken place. Okay, so firstly, we never attached the prediction of the impeachment to November 9, to a date. But we must also identify that impeachment is not, it's a process, right? It's not something that necessarily happens in a day. It's a process that takes place over a period of time. And we can delineate the steps in this process briefly. Has anyone looked into this? The process of impeachment within the US government. If you have looked into it, would you say? This is a very quiet class today. Yes?
So when impeachment happens, something happens both in the House of Representatives and in the Senate.
Yes, impeachment happens in both the House of Representatives and the Senate.
So that the impeachment inquiry will happen in the House of Representatives,
Uh-huh.
then the trial will happen in the Senate.
Okay, so there's an impeachment inquiry which happens in the House of Representatives, which is followed by a trial in the Senate.
So it's in the House of Representatives they draft the articles for which they are impeaching a given federal official.
Okay, the House of Representatives drafts the accusation or the articles of impeachment.
And then those articles in the House of Representatives require just a simple majority to be passed on from the House of Representatives to the Senate.
Yep, and then the House of Representatives votes by a simple majority rather to go ahead with the charges. Then it goes to the Senate.
And then in the Senate is where the trial happens with the senators as jurors, but the only presiding over is the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court.
Then the trial in the Senate happens in the trial happens in the Senate, but it's presided over by a Chief Justice of the Supreme Court.
Now, when a president is convicted of the charges which are contained in that case of impeachment, he will be removed from office if we have 2/3 of the senators agreeing to the removal.
If 2/3 of the senators convict, the president is removed from office.
But another thing I wanted to explain is that impeachment does not mean that a federal official has to be taken out of office. Impeachment means when charges have been filed against a federal official, that's what is called impeachment.
Yes, he's making the point. Impeachment is it does not mean that an official is going to be removed. It simply means that charges have formally been laid against a federal official, right?
Our friend is easy saying that people can be impeached, but it's not going to be removed from office. So they understand that impeachment is the secret to removing an official from office. What he does not mean.
Yes, yes. Okay, so just break it down. Right, the first step, he's laid it out. A president commits offenses that are deemed worthy of his being removed from office, right? So the process by which the formal process, the enshrined within the Constitution, by which a president who commits offenses can be removed for those offenses, is impeachment. So it begins with an inquiry, right? Essentially, an investigation that takes place in the House. I'm wondering how much of this to. Let me just. Emma, do you mind if I erase this? Right. All right, so you have the three organs of government, right? The legislature, the executive, which is the president, office of the president, and the judiciary, which is the Supreme Court. Now, when you have a federal official, in this case we're speaking of the president, who commits crimes or offenses worthy of his being removed from office, the formal process for this is this impeachment process. And it begins here in the legislature, right? Because you can't have the executive investigating and trying itself, right? So there's a division of powers between these three branches of government. So the process by which the president is investigated, tried, and either found guilty and removed or acquitted, it's initiated here in the legislature. And of course, the legislature has how many parts? Two. The House and the House and the Senate. So the Senate initiates the process with what is called an impeachment inquiry. This is the investigation into whether or not the sitting president is actually guilty of the crimes he's suspected of, or the crimes he's accused of. So this impeachment inquiry, this is the investigation. And at the conclusion of this investigation, a vote is held by simple majority. As to whether the president is guilty or innocent at the end of this investigation. If he's guilty, so say if guilty, if he's found guilty, he is impeached. So that's what impeachment is. Impeachment is essentially a finding of guilt by the House. The House brings formal charges and they find the sitting president guilty. That's what it means to be impeached. But the process is not complete. The next step is a trial in the Senate. And this trial in the Senate, it's presided over by a Supreme Court judge. So this is where the judiciary comes in. Supreme Court judge sits on the trial in the Senate, and then there is a vote. But here in the Senate, the vote must be by 2/3. And if found guilty, the president is removed from office. Right, so that's the process of impeachment. So what happened in 1868 with Andrew Johnson? He commits the offenses. The charges were brought to him by the House. The impeachment inquiry was initiated against him. The investigation was conducted, and he was found guilty. A majority of the House of Representatives found him guilty following the investigation of the accusations that were brought against him. And so he was thus impeached, right? Then commenced the trial in the Senate. And it was here in the Senate that the 2/3 majority threshold was not met. So he survived removal from office. He was not removed from office. Right. So this is what we see taking place. So when we come to 2019, can we trace the same development as a fulfillment of that which was predicted? With Donald Trump, when did the impeachment inquiry begin against him? When was this? Does anyone know off the top of their head? September 24. So we have Trump. September 24th, 2019. The impeachment inquiry begins against him. This is the investigation. When was he impeached? December? He's impeached December 18. And of course, what is taking place right now? The trial in the Senate. This is ongoing. But based on the prophecy on what happened with Andrew Johnson, what do we know is going to take place in the Senate? He's going to be acquitted. They won't meet the 2/3 majority. That is a specification of the prophecy that is identified here in 1868. But also, just looking at the situation, you can see it. Why? My brother is saying that who controls the House of Representatives? The Democrats, right? So with the Democrats, in this atmosphere of polarization, it was easier for them to, not that it was easier, because it's then making it sound like it was a political thing when he actually did commit the crimes, right? He committed the crimes. So, but in any case, the House of Representatives is controlled by the Democrats, right? And they were not inclined to give him any passes for the crimes he committed, for the things that he did, right? So they impeached him. But who controls the Senate? Right, the Republicans. And we know that there's a climate of radicalization within US politics, specifically the Republican Party. Hyper-partisanship, where they're supporting him no matter what. Right? In this climate, even secular commentators identifying that it's not likely that Trump would, that a Republican-controlled Senate will convict him and have him removed from office. But in any case, this is a specification of the prophecy anyway. Now, when you look at this fulfillment, I think it's important to recall the context in which it was given. Because I remember in 2018, when this was being laid out, what was being written in the newspapers, Washington Post and other newspapers? What were they saying? What were they saying? Firstly, there wasn't much talk of impeachment, but when it was raised, what was being said? No, it's fine. Say this. Well, that he will not be impeached, but that impeachment was highly unlikely. That it would be political suicide for the Democrats to raise an impeachment inquiry against Trump. Right? At the time this prediction was given, if you read what was being said in the news cycle, it was a very unlikely thing. So if the Democrats do this, it would be political suicide. They're not going to do. Even Democrats themselves were saying that this is it's not a worthwhile endeavor. It's going to hurt us rather than help us. That was the discussion at the time in 2018. But of course, we see now on the outside of 2019, the prophecy has been and is being fulfilled in accordance to the very specifications of it, right? So I think this one's easy to see, the impeachment of Andrew Johnson. As we begin to go back over these prophetic spans, we can trace the fulfillment of this prophecy. And I think what is also brought out by these and the other prophetic fulfillments that we'll see is, what is the nature of a prophetic fulfillment? What does a prophetic fulfillment look like? Right? Because what is the disease that we brought with us from Adventism? I'll call it a disease, the wrong way of thinking.
I think that prophecy fulfills in an abnormal way. When prophecies fulfill, it gets fulfilled at a normal place, at a normal situation.
Yeah,
When you are thinking, you expect something out of context to happen, so that prophecy will fulfill.
yeah. My brother's saying it in his own way, but he says we expect it to fulfill, as he said, in an abnormal way. Right? But a prophetic fulfillment, it looks very normal. Right? And when we're expecting sort of grand, spectacular, earth-shattering events, we fail to notice the rather mundane, rather normal-looking developments that actually constitute the fulfillment of prophecy. So I think it's important to see this, to understand what a prophetic fulfillment looks like, but also to see the progressive nature of prophetic fulfillments. Because a lot of the time, and this is where a lot of those who've separated from us, the trap that they're falling into is expecting singular events, a singular event to identify the fulfillment of a prophecy, when our fulfillments, the vast majority of the time, are progressive in nature, right? this prophecy of 1868 has been in fulfillment since September, and it's still under fulfillment. It's still being fulfilled. It's progressive in nature, right? And the next point I want to make is probably more clear in the next one that we will cover. So the impeachment of Andrew Johnson. That's a very easy one to see. Yes. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, that's an important point. Sister Emma is talking about August 11, 1840, which is something that's covered in Great Controversy. And the way it reads in Great Controversy, it reads like a spectacular event, that happened in a day. And, everyone saw it on the day, right? But when you read, and of course, Ellen White, she's just, how shall we say it? Summarizing, giving a broad sweep, right? But what did the fulfillment actually look like? There was no catastrophic fall of the Ottoman Empire. There wasn't, right? The Ottoman government continued. The what was his name? It wasn't the Sultan? Is it the Sultan? He retained his position. There was no coup. There was no overthrow. There was no bloodshed even. Right? As she said, it was just a passing of letters that took place, which changed the political relationship of the entities involved. And that's what constituted the fall of the Ottoman Empire, prophetically. Right? Letters were exchanged between governments that changed the political relationship of the powers in discussion. And then things continued as normal. And then they didn't have internet. It took weeks for the news to spread of what had happened. 6 weeks later, people get the news that this exchange took place. So even there, we realize that to identify the fulfillment of prophecy, we need to be observing keenly. We need to have an idea of what we're looking for. We need to be observing developments in relation to the subjects that we're considering. We need to consider these developments carefully and very keenly. So Johnson's impeached. Another one that I think is very easy for us to see is 490, 1529. Are you keeping time? I'm not sure how long I've been going, but... Right, so the prophetic span study. What took place in 1529? The second Diet of Spires. And what else? Because in Tessa's study, she identified two events in connection with 1529. The Siege of Vienna, right? So here we'll mark Diet of Spires. And the Siege of Vienna. What was the Siege of Vienna? revision. If anyone wants to narrate it in their own words, what was the Siege of Vienna? Do we remember what that was? Siege of Vienna, what happened? I know you know. Let me see. Let me see if there's someone else. I've not done a good job of picking on you. Someone. What do you remember? You don't have to know the whole thing. Maybe put in some details. Someone else can put in more details. What happened at the Siege of Vienna? Yes.
You have the wrestling of Ottoman Empire, the first defeat of the Ottoman.
My brother is saying the Ottoman Empire was defeated. By who? Was it by Rome?
Not sure by who.
Okay, who defeated the Ottomans? Benjamin. Austria, was it Austria or Hungary? Of course, Austria-Hungary. Okay, but, okay. Anyway, Wikipedia says Hungary. But I know that, for a while there were one kingdom, right? So you have the Ottoman Empire. It's defeated by Hungary. Now I'll speak to this, but I'll read. This is from Encyclopedia Britannica. Just a few lines. It says, the Siege of Vienna, September to October 1529. In 1529, the Ottoman Empire made a determined effort to capture Vienna, the capital of the Habsburg Austrian Empire. So you're right, Austria. Habsburg Austrian Empire. Their failure to take Vienna marked the end of Turkish expansion into Europe and was followed by the diversion of Ottoman effort toward Asia and the Mediterranean. Right, so in describing this siege, it says, attack after attack was repulsed by the Austrian defenders, who picked off the Ottoman troops with their arquebuses, with their rifles, from the high walls of the city, and forced back those who scaled the walls by using long pikes. In late October, Suleiman is the Ottoman Sultan. Suleiman ordered one last all-out assault, but this was also repulsed. Suleiman then ordered a retreat of his battered army, which turned into a disastrous ordeal as winter snows came early, causing many deaths and loss of the remaining artillery. Defeat at Vienna forced Suleiman back into Ottoman Hungary, and after a second failure to take Vienna in 1532, he abandoned thoughts of conquering Europe. So we have the trumpet power, the second woe, the Ottoman Empire. And they are making efforts to conquer Western Europe. They're making efforts to conquer the Western world. Now, the frontier of, the Ottoman Empire with the Western world was Austria. When trying to conquer Western Europe, Austria was the gateway to Western Europe. So Austria was the first line of defense against the invading Muslims. In fact, it's a point even today that the Austrians say, if it wasn't for us speaking to Western Europe, if it wasn't for us, you'd all be Muslim, right? If it wasn't for them, Western Europe would be Muslim, because they were the front line of defense against the invading Islamic armies. So Vienna, the capital of the Austrian Empire, Suleiman, the Turkish Sultan, he besieged Vienna in his effort to take Austria as a first step to conquering Western Europe. But the siege was a disaster, right? He met fierce opposition. He was forced to retreat, and in that retreat, the elements firstly, during the siege, it was raining. His soldiers got sick, and so on. They died. In his retreat, winter came early. Many more even died in the snow, right? So it was so disastrous, this defeat or this failure, this failed siege of Vienna, that it basically it ended all their attempts to conquer Western Europe, right? So we see the Ottoman Empire, was it destroyed? No, it wasn't. It wasn't destroyed. It's still within the period of its supremacy. So it wasn't destroyed. But we see that in its efforts to conquer Western Europe, it was restrained, right? So we see a trumpet power, the second woe, being restrained in its warfare against the West. That's what the Siege of Vienna is bringing to view. So now we come to 2019. And my question is, what do we see by way of fulfillment? Has someone thought about this, or does someone want to venture any thoughts? What do we see by way of fulfillment? Maybe just wait. Let's see. Let's see who can. Okay, my brother, yeah, man.
So I think in 2019, due to the American involvement in Syria, we saw the defeat of ISIS, the defeat of Islam, and the abolition of the caliphate. And it's the same year we also see their leader, Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, being killed.
Right. Okay. So you're identifying, again, that's great, because I think it's one of the easy ones to see. 1529 to 2019. Do we see a restraint of Islam? Not the second woe now, but the third woe in 2019, and we do. Right? My brother pointed out that ISIS lost all its territory. In March of 2019. ISIS lost its last territory. This was it's called Baghouz. Baghouz, let me write it down. No, that's later. So here, the territory that it lost is Baghouz. Right? And then, of course, later that same year, what do we see? When in that year? October 26. What do we see? The leader of ISIS was killed. So when we look at these developments with ISIS in 2019, these are what we're saying constitutes the fulfillment of the Siege of Vienna. Firstly, ISIS is an Islamic state. It declared its caliphate in 2014. And the state has land, it has territory. So we see it suffering a blow as it loses its last piece of land. This place called Baghouz in March of 2019 to the Syrian forces. And later that same year, on the 26th of October, the leader who declared the caliphate, he is himself killed. Now, ISIS is not finished. They're still active, and they very quickly elected a new leader. But definitely, this constitutes a restraint, right? A restraint has been placed upon them in their warfare against the West. So Siege of Vienna, meets its fulfillment in 2019. And what's also important to see is that it's what? It's progressive, right? So if you're looking for a single event to say this is the restraint, you don't necessarily see that. But if you're tracing a history, the development of the history of this particular entity in a progressive manner, you're better able to see what is being brought out by the Siege of Vienna, which is the restraint of this power. It's not something that happened in a day. It was a progressive development. Does that make sense? Now, the next event in 1529 was the Diet of Spires. Now we're going to look at that briefly. So I haven't been keeping track of time at all. I don't know if I'm 6 minutes. Okay. All right, Diet of Spires. Does someone want to narrate, recap as Elder Tess laid it out? What was she identifying? What took place at the Diet of Spires? Don't identify the symbolic significance. Maybe just lay out the history, what was going on first. Do you have thoughts? Good.
The Protestant or the evangelicals coming together to
Evangelicals. The Protestants, you're right. They're not evangelicals. It's Protestants.
Anyway, there are Protestants who are coming together they have a meeting of they will stand for the truth.
All right, they were standing for the truth. Why? Why did they have to come and take a stand? What was happening? Because
There's a meeting that it was organized that they want to abolish Protestantism.
okay, who what meeting? Who was?
So it was the Catholics and the government.
Okay, so the Catholic got together with the government, the king, and they determined to abolish the Reformation, right? And then you have princes, Protestant princes, who convened and they stood up to and raised their voices against this development. Okay. So that's basically what happened. We'll look at it in the Great Controversy. I think we'll take a break, and when we come back from the break, we'll read Great Controversy, page 197. Just by way of recap, and then we'll begin to discuss what we can see. Okay, so I hope that's been a useful exercise. Let's close the word of prayer. Father in heaven, we thank you, Lord, for the ground we've been able to cover. We thank you for the opportunity to be at a school like this one and to consider the light that you're opening up before your people. Lord, please guide us into all truth. We know that as we go forward, clarity will be brought to our past. And as we see clarity on our past, Lord, may you guide us into all truth. May these studies be a blessing, and all the studies over the remainder of the school, may they offer rich blessings to your people, that we may have greater confidence in the movement and confidence in you as the movement's leader. Please bless us now as we break, for we ask in Jesus' name. Amen.